Dale's on his way up. Our next speaker is Dr. Dale Gentry, the Director of Conservation for Audubon's Upper Mississippi Regional Office. Dale and his team develop and implement Audubon conservation and science programs in Minnesota, Iowa, and Missouri. Before starting with Audubon in 2012, Dale spent 15 years in higher education as a professor at the Teton Science Schools in Grand Teton National Park and the University of Northwestern St. Paul, studying keystone species concept in cavity nesters and the ability of woodpeckers to act as a biological control for emerald ash borer. Dale lives in Shoreview with his family, enjoys birdwatching, cooking, cycling, and Nordic skiing. Dale.
Thanks for that introduction. And I want to get things started right here. If everybody can just smile for me really quickly. All right. Good to have a little photo documentation of how wonderful the MOU community is. Grateful to the committee for inviting me to speak, or not inviting me, but allowing me to speak today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Audubon's work in the Mississippi River floodplain and why it is important and hopefully maybe of interest to some of you, either as birders, as interest in the bird community in Minnesota. So most of you are aware that Minnesota exists kind of at the northern end of a migratory pathway, right? We talk about flyways. It's a very imprecise concept, but we know there's a north-south migration, and then a lot of birds will follow geographic landmarks like the coasts on the east and west, the mountain ranges in the Rockies, and then a lot of birds do like to follow the Mississippi River. This is driven some by habitat preferences, some by habitat loss, as we see what the conditions are like across, especially the agricultural-dominated Great Plains. If you are a forest bird, this is some of the best and most contiguous forest habitat available. So the forests of the Mississippi River are important not only because they provide that connective migratory stopover habitat, but they also provide just important and unique habitat that's different from a lot of the other forests nearby. For those of you that have spent a little bit of time out exploring the Mississippi River floodplain, you know it's a wonderful, dynamic space that is a mosaic of open water and emergent marsh and floodplain forest that should be moving constantly from one type to a next, a very historically, naturally dynamic ecosystem that is always changing because the river was always changing. Before I get back into the floodplain forest, I'm going to very briefly do a little recruitment for another type of wetland monitoring. The Audubon Society is going to be rerunning a statewide marsh bird survey. Some of you may have participated in this in 2016 and 2017. We're going to do it again. If you're interested in supporting that effort, there are some flyers over at the little Audubon table, and I would love for you to check in and volunteer if you're interested. But we're going to spend most of our time today talking about forested marshlands. So I'll actually come back to this in a little bit. So those forested marshlands of the Mississippi River have, as I said, historically a healthy, dynamic system. But what we've seen of late is that those forests are just generally in decline. You can see in this little highlighted box in the bottom left in red that basically every way we measure bottomland forests in the part of the river that is inundated by dams, forests are in decline. Right? And so if you look at the map on the right, we compare the forest, and I know that that text is too small to read, but just know that the dark green is the forest, that the Mississippi River has just been dramatically altered in the way that it looks and the way it functions. And so those floodplain forests are much less abundant than they once were. And this is therefore, again, of course, a concern to those of us that are aware that those floodplain forests are incredibly important habitat to a broad suite of migratory and breeding birds. So some of these changes are starting to grab the attention of people outside of the birding community. And I want to thank Madeline Heim, who's actually with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, for doing an amazing suite of stories on this, 4 or 5 different stories, all connecting about the Mississippi River and including the floodplain forests. And for those of you that have made it out onto the river in the past 5 years and maybe driven down from Red Wing to La Crosse, those big stands of dead trees are not healthy. That's not what we want things to look like. Of course, mortality is natural, disturbance is natural, but the rate at which we're seeing disturbance is unhealthy, and we're working to try and address that. So what's driving that mortality? Well, of course, the Mississippi River, as I said, once used to be a very dynamic system that is now a relatively stable and stationary system because we built dams in the 1930s to make the Mississippi River reliably navigable. We wanted to ship grain and other goods from the Twin Cities and the upper Midwest down into the Gulf of Mexico and out into, of course, the world. And we made lots of different attempts to try and make that happen. And we're really not very successful until we built this system of dams. So there are 26 dams between Minneapolis and St. Louis. Once you get south of St. Louis, the river is a different system. It's wide open. You don't need dams anymore, and you can just navigate it more naturally. So we built those dams in the 30s, and of course we lost a lot of floodplain forest because we flooded what was historically a shallower system with rapids. It's hard to imagine the Mississippi River used to have, number one, relatively clean water, and number two, a series of dynamic riffles and runs and rapids. It's now more of a system of pools. So we lost a lot of our floodplain forest in the 30s, but now we're starting to lose it again. What's happening now? Well, in addition to things like emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease, we're starting to see changes in patterns in our climate. And those of you that recall, for example, the big snow and therefore runoff events of 2019, and the river stayed flooded for months and months, almost the entire summer. Even these flood-adapted trees in the floodplain forests can't handle their roots being submerged for that long, and many of those trees died in response to some of these climate-linked flooding patterns that we're seeing on the Mississippi River. So lots of concern about the loss of floodplain forests, therefore lots of people saying, let's do something about it. It's important to not just to birds, but to our human communities as well. So there are a number of different partners invested in the maintenance of bottomland forests in the Mississippi River. Arguably the most important one is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, because they're kind of the bosses of the river. They run the system of dams that dictates how the river flows. And they are, in our region, good partners in this conservation. They want the forest to be maintained. They don't want it enough to remove the dams, but as long as they're willing to keep the dams in place and keep the barges flowing, they want those forests to be healthy and to be restored. And so they, along with a suite of partners, created a forest stewardship plan. How do we restore and retain our forests? And that forest stewardship plan identified a number of priorities and also identified a number of wildlife species that they're trying to manage for. And first and foremost among those wildlife species were a suite of birds that use the bottomland forest for habitat, again, for breeding and migratory stopover. So they said, we want more forests. We want forests to be beneficial habitat for these birds, but what we don't know is how to accomplish those goals. Right? They didn't have clear direction about what these forests should look like, what the birds are selecting, and so it identified the need to do some new science and identify the habitat preferences of the suite of birds that they're trying to manage for. So at that point, the Audubon and the Army Corps in 2018 developed a forest avian stewardship plan and said, let's restore forests, let's do it for the birds of conservation need that we all agree are priorities. And so again, in 2018, we went through this process, and actually Kristen Hall, who's in the room, helped to develop this document. So this plan led to some monitoring that Audubon has been involved in for now over a decade. The monitoring started before this plan existed because we knew it was in the works, but we did develop this plan along the way. And that monitoring, again, was done for the explicit purpose of giving the Army Corps, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the state agencies involved in the management of the bottomland forests along the Mississippi River prescriptions. This is what the forest should look like. Here's how to get them there so that we can provide habitat for those suite of wildlife and for our own interests as well. Lots and lots of different partners involved in all these. I didn't list all the state DNRs. but we are grateful for the funding from all the different agencies, and including state funds from Minnesota Outdoor Heritage Fund and LCCMR funds to support the both monitoring and bottomland forest restoration efforts. So I want to talk mostly about bird monitoring and science, but also just acknowledge that Audubon has been able to play a little bit of our own role in doing some of this bottomland forest restoration. We have a forest ecologist based in the La Crosse district office, which is one of the four districts of the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife and Fish Refuge that spans from roughly Red Wing down into central Iowa, and have been able to do a lot of restoration, impacting over 3,000 acres and planting some 160,000 trees. So we were able to not only study the birds, but also implement some of what we're learning about the habitats they need and how to restore some of these beautiful bottomland forests. So again, the goals of that bottomland forest and avian stewardship plan said we need to establish a rigorous, standardized method for assessing the community and the habitats that they need. And so we identified 9 focal species, about half of which are relatively common species in the bottomland forest, and the other half of which are quite rare and species that we are desperately trying to manage habitat for. And then we initiated, again, this monitoring program so that we could understand the species populations, we could understand their habitat needs, we could understand the spatial regions in which they are some more abundant and some less abundant. And so you'll see within this suite of 9 focal species, 8 of them which are present in the bottomland forests in Minnesota. One of them doesn't quite fit in. Some of you, I won't ask for contributions, but you recognize in the middle, yellow-breasted chat also there. This plan was developed largely on the lower end of the upper river, which is sort of a complicated term, right? So if we think about from Minneapolis to St. Louis, the lower end is Missouri, Illinois, southern Iowa region, where chats are found on the river. But the rest of these species are at least possible as bottomland forest species. So we started doing this monitoring program to try and achieve all of those goals of assessing the community, identifying their habitat preferences, and making recommendations to the land managers. So this work started in 2014 down in the southern end of the river in the St. Louis district. We expanded it into the Minnesota and Wisconsin regions so that we could have a better sense of the suite of bottomland forest habitat and conditions along the entire region of that, again, the impounded stretch of the river from Minnesota down into St. Louis, and leaking a little bit down into the unimpounded stretch from St. Louis down to Cairo, Illinois as well. So what did we do? We conducted point counts. We sent people out to identify birds in wonderful places. I appreciated Josh's descriptions earlier of what it's like to be a bog biologist, and being a bottomland biologist is also quite an adventure. Oops. Putting on waders and sometimes maxing them out, and few mosquitoes here and there, but being surrounded by prothonotary warblers and bald eagles and stuff, you deal with it. It's a pretty magical place. I think also just exciting because it's a place that just not very many people make it out into, right? Not everybody has a boat and gets to go out and navigate through this flooded forest. It's really interesting and fun. So again, we conducted bird surveys, calculated bird densities, modeled habitat associations, and developed a spatial prioritization. And eventually I'll get to the point of us developing management recommendations, which we're in the process of doing right now. So some people are like, what do you see out there, right? Well, these are the birds. These are the 10 most commonly observed birds in the bottomland forest habitats. Many of these, you're like, yep, get to see these all the time out in my backyard, with the possible exception of prothonotary warblers. How great is that, right? In the Twin Cities, that's a pretty exciting bird. If you make your way out into the bottomland forest down in southeastern Minnesota, they are abundant. 2 prothonotary at every single point, give or take. They really, once you get the right habitat, if you go far enough southeastern Minnesota, they are abundant, which is pretty exciting. Interesting patterns, though, too, around things like indigo buntings, which, of course, are common in the uplands, but relatively scarce in the bottomland forests in Minnesota and Wisconsin. You get down into Missouri and Illinois, they are more abundant in the bottomlands than they are in the uplands. So we get interesting regional differences in some of the habitat preferences for some of these species. So lots of other things. Also note, one of my sort of personal favorites, yellow-throated vireos are super abundant in these bottomland forests. More yellow-throated than red-eyed vireos. Red-eyed vireos kind of disappear, yellow-throated vireos come in, and you get about 2 to 1 yellow-throated to red-eyed. So you do get some interesting patterns around just the species you expect to see. I want to throw up, I know we're kind of tight on time, so I'm going to try and go through some of this quickly. Just some interesting patterns with what we're seeing. The green upper UMR, that basically means pools 13 through 1, so that's central Iowa up to the Twin Cities. Lower UMR, lower upper Mississippi River, lower upper, that's a lot, right? That's pools 13 down to, so that's roughly central Iowa down to St. Louis. So American redstarts declining. Interesting because if you look at eBird status and trends, American redstarts are increasing across the upper Midwest. So if you get up and out of the floodplain forest, redstarts are becoming more abundant, but in the floodplain forest, they are declining. So something about that habitat is subtly becoming less attractive to them. Indigo buntings, also, again, interesting that they're kind of scarce in our region, but relatively abundant further south, but increasing in our region and decreasing further south. Prothonotary warblers, relatively abundant everywhere, but decreasing everywhere. They are kind of our species of greatest interest that we would really like to impact because they are the ones that are most dependent on this habitat of all the suite of birds that we're really paying attention to. Red-headed woodpeckers, also, we think of them as oak savanna obligates in Minnesota, right? Not oak savanna obligates. They're all over the floodplain in the southern part of the river. Up here, we get some, but not super abundant. So they're more interested in structure than they are in specific oak savannas. So, and then, well, I'm just going to skip over warbling vireos. So again, good numbers, good data for a lot of these species, but unfortunately, our models are very data hungry. They're kind of, they require a lot of information, and we didn't have enough data to model some of the species that we were most interested in, which kind of stinks, right? But cerulean warbler, red-shouldered hawk, willow flycatcher, yellow-breasted chat, we're lacking data in some of those species. But we do have plans, speaking of our technology focus today, that especially with cerulean warblers, we believe that if we get out earlier in the season with autonomous recording units, we'll pick these birds up. We think they're there, but they're done singing before we start our surveys in June 1st. They're early migrants, and they stop singing once they build their nest. And so our auditory point counts we think are not picking them up. Generally speaking, every species is either stable or declining, except for a red-headed woodpecker. Interesting, right? That's a desirable species to have increasing, but kind of discouraging news there that most of our species are declining. Here's what we're really tasked with by the Army Corps. They want to know habitat associations. I forgot to mention that all of these point counts were co-located with forest inventory plots that the Army Corps points out so that we know what the habitat conditions are like where we're doing the bird survey. And so we can then model habitat preferences for each of these species and provide pretty specific recommendations to the forest managers for this is what these birds are looking for, and this is what our forest restoration should look like. Spatial prioritization, again, small text, but green is good, brown is bad here. So the driftless region really stands out as incredibly important to many of these species. And central and southern Missouri also, so this will guide our work in the future. And just big picture takeaways, population declines, not surprising in some cases when the habitat's declining, but these are efforts that we're trying to discourage. We're not seeing a lot of forest regeneration in the upper pools. There's no young trees out there, which is why we need active management. And then, as I said, we are in the process of developing a manual to guide this management, a Bottomland Forest for Birds manual, and that is in development right now. Will probably be out in about a year from now, just a little bit over a year from now. So we are going to continue this work. We believe that the long-term data is the only way to track these populations and their habitats. And fortunately, we have support from most of our funders to support that work. ARUs, I think, will help us with some of the species that have been a little bit harder to track down. And as I said, I'm going to come back to this. We want to expand beyond not just forest wetlands, but also wetlands in general. And so Audubon is, with partners, going to be redoing our statewide Minnesota wetland secretive marsh bird wetland survey. So if those of you that are interested in helping out with that, again, there are flyers over on the Audubon table, and we'd love to have your support there. So I know we're short on time. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you about this work. Happy to answer any questions if there's time, or I'll be around when we're done.
We've got time for 2 questions. Just 2.
How significant is the impact of depositing dredging materials in the floodplain? And also, have you gotten a sense from the Corps that they would be open to releasing more water in the spring so it doesn't pile up and flood the...
Yes, fantastic questions. Thank you for that. So the dredge material is complicated because, the Army Corps has a problem. They have too much of it. They don't know what to do with it. And we could use it to build up these islands, increase the elevation, decrease the flooding. There's some willingness and interest in doing that, but it'd be very expensive. It's much cheaper for them to just dump it all in the middle of these islands and then sort of deal with it later. So I'm part of a group that's trying to say, hey, can we take a more active role in developing more practical, beneficial uses of these dredge material? So we're working on that. There are different rules in the southern part down in St. Louis. They can just dig the dredge material up out of the middle of the river and then deposit it on the sides and actually create these little ephemeral sandy islands, which are sometimes used by least terns when we're like psyched about that. That is against policy in the upper part of the river. We're not allowed to do that in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So again, trying to address some of these things. And then the flooding is, interestingly, when the water's high, they open those dams up all the way and there's nothing holding the water back. So usually when it's like really, really flooded, the dams are not the fault. Floods are a natural part of the system. It's the extension or the extent of the floods, the duration of the floods driven by rain in many cases. That's a bigger part of the problem than the actual dams themselves at this stage in life. Yeah.
Thank you, Dale.
Yeah.